I'm Pastor Everett Flanigan, Associate Pastor at Christ Our Hope, and also Administrative Dean at the Lutheran Theological Center in Atlanta. I am a husband, a father, and a grandfather. I'm a pastor. I was trained originally as a scientist, and I have a considerable background with community work and with teaching and education. My pathway to becoming a pastor is long and convoluted. It's almost as if God said, I'm going to let you go off and do some of the things you want to do, but I'm not going to let you off the hook. So for 30 years, I did science, and I had a ball doing science. It was not a single moment. Toward the end of my time with the pharmaceutical company, we just noticed, my wife and I just noticed that my interest, my reading interest, and all of that was changing. And that happened because we had a pastor to resign as pastor of the Lutheran church that we were attending in Kankakee, Illinois. And it was going to be about a month or so, at least a month, before the bishop could provide us with an interim pastor. Meanwhile, 2 or 3 of us had to put the worship services together and continue the visitations, the prayer meetings, the teaching. We had to continue that. And so, along with the change that I was experiencing in my reading habits, not so much science, but more philosophy and religion, that sort of, everything sort of meshed. And so, I started actually doing sermons and doing a lot of teaching. And so there was more or less a smooth flow into the ministry. And as I talked with a colleague there in Chicago at Churchwide, he suggested that I actually pursue seminary studies. And that those seminary studies, of course, led to the desire to become ordained. Now, there's another piece to that I only tell a few people, and that has to do with a grandfather who was a minister, but he did not have seminary experience. When I was born, he declared to my mother and father that I was the one. And in the black experience, when a grandfather or an elder says you are the one, that means they feel that you have been designated for something special. You are the one. He fully expected me to go to the family school, that was Clark College at that time, and then go into religion and philosophy, and then go to seminary. But instead, I had other desires. Actually, I majored in chemistry. And he was disappointed, but he didn't say anything. My parents were sort of happy with that. And after I got the degree in chemistry, rather than going to seminary, I decided to go to graduate school in chemistry and biochemistry. So he was further disappointed. And then after that, I went to work on a PhD in the same areas. So he didn't see my going, finally attending seminary and finally becoming ordained. He died in the 1990s in that segment. Lutheran pastors throughout the history of the Lutheran Church, certainly since Luther himself, Lutheran pastors had always been involved in some type of science, or some type of scientific explorations. So the Lutheranism itself actually validated my interest in science, but at the same time, my interest in how God does his work in the world. As you know, Luther believed that Luther's belief could be summarized in a statement called the priesthood of all believers, or a concept. And that is that the work that we do in the world, whether it's as a scientist, whether it's a truck driver, or a farmer, or any work that's done, is done for the betterment and for the care and well-being of God's people. And so Luther felt, and the priesthood of all believers simply tells us, that the work of the truck driver is just as important in God's eyes as the work of the priest or the work of the pastor. So this was a validation of the work. And certainly all of the work that is done in research in the pharmaceutical company was done for the betterment of human beings, for God's people. Just as the work that I'm doing now in education over at the Lutheran Center or in the congregation is done in service to God's people and in service to God. There is an opportunity for the church to more or less retool itself. The church may need to reestablish itself and make connections with ordinary people, with people in communities, with people who are suffering. And while we do that at a high level, we don't do that at a grassroots level. We don't do that in community. And I think that is surely a need for the church. It's one thing as a pastor to preach on Sunday, but it's another thing to live out our understanding of grace and our understanding of the gospel by rolling up our sleeves and actually going into the community to do work with our hands and to be visible and to make sure that our church and our congregations are visible in terms of what we do in addition to what we say. In this pandemic, and in all of the other epidemics and pandemics, all times of trouble in human history, God has been present. God has been present through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, just as Jesus Christ died on a cross as part of his saving grace for human beings or humankind. God is present now. We see them every day, but we don't notice God. God is in that doctor's eyes and in that doctor's hands and in his brain as he works to alleviate the suffering and to save people from dying from this pandemic or from the infection. God is in those nurses who are there. God is in that ambulance driver. God is right there with the police and other people who are, in fact, working to save human beings and to save lives. God is in the pastors who are bringing comfort to people. God is in those relatives as they seek to comfort the dying and to be with them. God is in those people who are providing the food, those grocery store clerks, all of that, the first responders. God is right there. He is with us. And that is how God does the work in the world. God does his work in the world through his people who love him and who seek to carry out his desires and his directions. I'm Pastor Everett Flanigan. I would like to remind all of you, and remind myself, during this time of the pandemic, that God is with us. God has not deserted us. God is not punishing us. And I would like to remind all of us that we can do all things through Jesus Christ.